Thanks, Janet, for the Bible reading. Now, I remember when I was a kid, Disney films, well, they were just for children. Adults sometimes watched them, but Disney films were there for kids, weren't they? But now they're jam-packed with quotes and bits, Easter eggs they call them, for the adults. And one of my favourite quotes comes from the film The Incredibles. That bit where Syndrome explains why he wants to destroy all the superheroes and why he wants to make superpowers available for all humanity. This is Syndrome's super villain speech where he says, "I'll give them the most spectacular heroics anyone's ever seen. And when I'm old and I've had my fun, I'll sell my inventions so that everyone can be superheroes. Everyone can be super. And when everyone's super, no one will be." See, what he's saying in effect is that if everyone is super, no one is, in the sense that we're all exactly the same. And in our Bible passage this morning, Jesus is saying something similar. He's saying that if everyone is a sinner, then we should treat everyone equally. You see, today I want to do something you might think is a bit strange. I want to give an apologetic for sin. I think we should be talking about sin more, not less. See, all my life I've heard people saying that the church should speak less about sin, saying it's a sin, stop doing that. You know, whatever the current moral debate, in my lifetime it's been discussing nationally things like abortion or divorce or human sexuality, whatever it is. Each time Christians are being told, you sound judgmental and self-righteous when you call something a sin. Now, I know this sounds back to front, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but here in Mark 2, Jesus tells us it's actually the other way round. People who believe that we're all sinners should be tolerant and welcoming to all. It's people who think they're not sinners. They're the ones who are judgmental and full of hate. But the people who know they're a sinner, they're the ones that know they need the sin doctor. That's sin doctor, by the way, not spin doctor. So let's look at Mark 2, verses 13 to 17, as we're introduced this week to Jesus as the sin doctor. Okay, point number one, and this is looking at verses 13 and 14 especially. Number one, talking with the tax man. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. Everybody loves Jesus, don't they? Jesus is the model of inclusivity. Even other religions, even atheists, often cite Jesus as an example of tolerance and acceptance, the way he goes to the margins of society. Like here with Levi, or Matthew as he's sometimes called. Now, I know people sometimes make jokes about the tax man because nobody enjoys paying tax, but you've got to crank it up a whole new level when we're thinking about tax collectors in Jesus' day. Think about how people, the fellow Jews, would treat Levi. Because Levi didn't just collect taxes, like for the HMRC. He did it for the Romans, and they were the occupying power. This was more like the French Nazi sympathizers in Paris in World War II. You can't touch them, but everyone despises them. They're traitors to their people. And on top of that, tax collectors exploited their position of power by charging way, way more than the Romans asked for so that they could become fabulously wealthy off the back of their own people's misery and suffering. I suppose today Levi might be a drug dealer. And if so, Jesus made a beeline, as he's walking along, he made a beeline to the car park where Levi dealt. And he went straight up to Levi and he looked him straight in the eyes and said, "You're coming with me right now." Amazing. Amazing. Any self-respecting Jew would go out of their way to avoid Levi. They might spit in front of him or shout insults behind his back. But Jesus wants Levi to be one of his followers. Did you get that? Because if we read the story, we're thinking, what is going on, Jesus? That's not where you go looking for disciples. Surely we'd expect Jesus to go to, say, LST or Oak Hill as his first stop, or maybe a really good church. Why a tax collector? That is a really odd recruitment policy. That's a bit like the GB Olympics coach saying, well, I'm not going to go to athletics clubs to find the next Mo Farah. I'm going to find him in KFC, stuffing his face with fried chicken. But that is what Jesus does. And more than that, if you sneak a peek into verse 15, you'll see that then Jesus goes to Levi's house for dinner. Actually, what Mark writes here, it just says that they were having dinner in his house. And Mark doesn't make it clear whether that's Jesus' house or Mark's house. We only find that out from Luke in his gospel. Luke tells us that it's Levi's house, so let's stick with that. But the point is that the way Mark tells the stories, it doesn't really matter whose house it is, because clearly Mark is telling the story so that we're clear that Jesus is totally at home with Levi, really comfortable with Levi and his friends having a meal together. And I want to say that's what I miss most about lockdown. So frustrating, isn't it, that we're divided. We can't meet up for coffee, can't go to Costa's, can't have someone over to your house for a meal or go out to eat together. And we miss that because that's how relationships grow. And that is true in any culture, anywhere in the world. A friendship is taken to a whole new level when you share a meal together. Hospitality says something profound in any language about welcome and acceptance. In most settings in life, like obviously especially at work, our relationships are formal. But when you have a meal together, you're just simply human beings getting to know one another. And therefore, I want to say that if you want to be a follower of Jesus, it is worth thinking carefully about what you can do to welcome people and accept people the way that Jesus did. Now, of course, it's so much harder under lockdown, but we can still pick up the phone and we can still take the initiative to ring people that we wouldn't normally talk to. See the way that Jesus was proactive and intentionally sinking out those who are on the margins of society. And as I say that word intentionally. Do you see how intentional Jesus was with Levi? He saw Levi and he sought him out and said, "Come, follow me." And of course, that kind of intentionality is awkward. It can, like here in this story, lead to miscommunication and hurt feelings. But like Jesus, you have to take the initiative if you are to be welcoming. Jesus wasn't just some nice hippie who sort of just sat there and only waited for people to come to him. He took the initiative in welcoming people. And of course, most of all, I suppose this means that we long now for lockdown to end so that we can go back to doing these kind of things. But why not prepare for that even now? Draw up a list of people that as soon as we're able to, you're going to maybe invite them over or go out for a cuppa or meet up in some way. Be intentional about that as soon as lockdown is over. So as well as being creative about it now, I think it's appropriate also to grieve and just be sad that we're missing out on doing this because it's so important. And use that sadness, as it were, to redouble our determination to get back to doing this even more when we have the opportunity to do it, to deepen relationships and welcome and include others. And all of this, wonderfully in this passage, leads to communion that we're going to mark in a moment. The meal of welcome and acceptance. Probably I would say that communion is the aspect of church life that feels most weird at the moment as we try to celebrate it online. As I said, in a moment we're going to celebrate it in a fashion. But it's not the same online, is it? One of the points of communion is that when we eat together, we do in equal standing before the cross of Christ. That those who share the bread together are one body. And so as we eat the bread together, we are recognizing the body, as it says in 1 Corinthians 11. And that means recognizing Levi maybe in our midst and saying, Levi, you're just as much a part of Christ as I am. And we're not able to do that we miss that part of communion terribly at the moment, because as you eat your bread wherever you are at home, and I eat my bread in my home, we don't know, we're not really seeing one another, and we miss that. I have no idea who else is doing it at the same time. So I think that gives us another thing to look forward to, doesn't it? Look forward to that first communion that we'll be able to celebrate all together in body as a church. And how wonderful that be, because we'll be doing it all together and recognizing one another and all that's implied in the wonder of that. That we're saying welcome. We're saying we're accepting as equals everyone else who eats and drinks together with us. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to celebrate communion. So let's do that. Thanks, Karen, for that activity. Now we're back in Mark chapter 2, and we have our second point. Supper with sinners in verses 15 to 16. So talking with the tax man, and now supper with sinners in 15 and 16. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. I have come to call the righteous." I got that completely wrong. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And that's the really important part. So, Jesus is enjoying eating supper at Levi's house. And Levi wasn't the only tax collector there. In fact, Mark records that there were loads of tax collectors and those called as sinners, because, according to Mark, they were the kind of people that Jesus attracted, and they followed Jesus in their droves. And this got the goat of the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. These were two groups of religious leaders in Jesus' day, particularly the Pharisees. And sinners was a religious term used to refer to people who failed to keep the religious law of Judaism in kind of blatant and flagrant ways. In the Gospels, usually sinners is referred maybe to those who've committed fraud or adultery. Now, the fact that Mark records their question, as he does, shows that this was a common policy of Jesus. That what Jesus was doing here was not sort of a one-off event taken out of context. No, Jesus was always eating with sinners and tax collectors and people like that. And the religious leaders took this to mean guilty by association. That just because Jesus was hanging out with people who disobeyed God's law, it must mean that he did too. Yet their question tees up Jesus nicely to give a summary statement of his ministry on earth. He says, and I'll get it right this time, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but those who are ill. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." It's a wonderful riposte to them, isn't it? He's saying, in effect, if you don't think you need God's mercy, then why don't you just let me get on with people who do? Jesus is the sin doctor, and he's come to people who admit that they're ill, that they're sinners, and they need healing. One of the challenges we've experienced recently, isn't it, of rolling out the vaccine has been keeping healthcare workers safe. You know, how do you inject all these people, but without catching the virus yourself? After all, this is one thing we cannot do online, isn't it? Well, similarly, Jesus, as it were, is going around injecting people with God's grace and mercy, and he has to get up close and personal to do that. And the Pharisees are so worried about catching the virus of sin that they won't lift a finger to help people who are caught up in it. And of course, the irony is they've got the virus already. So that's our question for today. Do you need the sin doctor? Jesus did not accept Levi because he condoned his lifestyle or anything like that. Jesus welcomed Levi because Levi admitted that he had the disease of sin, and he came to Jesus as the one with the cure, the doctor. So this morning, do you need the sin doctor? Jesus came only for people who admit that they do. And as we see this story, we can begin to see that there are two ways in which we can become judgmental, just like the Pharisees. And the first way is by guilt by association, assuming that befriending someone automatically means you agree with everything about their lifestyle and condoning everything that they do. But the second way we can become judgmental, like the Pharisees, is by stopping talking about sin. See, as I said at the start, I think what we see here is the only way to become a genuinely tolerant society is when we believe that everyone is a sinner. See, think about it for a moment. If we stop labeling behavior that's against what the Bible teaches as sin, as we stop using that category, what happens? Well, to begin with, I suppose you might just assume that everybody is basically good. But that kind of thing, it doesn't last long, because you just switch on the news and there's some story about a murderer or a rapist or sex trafficking or war or something. And so you think, okay, well, clearly it can't be true that everybody's basically good. So what I've got to do is divide the world into good people and bad people. Bingo. The moment you do that, you've now immediately unleashed hate onto all the bad people in the world. Sure, you probably draw the line differently to the Pharisees, but it's exactly the same attitude. In fact, I have to say that some of the most intolerant and judgmental people I've met have come from churches who officially label themselves inclusive. I was watching online recently a very clever video. Amy Horowitz, he's an American commentator, and I came across an election video he did. This is just after Joe Biden had been elected in the US president. I guess I'd probably disagree with a lot of his politics, but what Amy Horowitz did in this video was very clever. He went out onto the streets of New York City and interviewed lots of people he could meet, that kind of pop vox interview. You could tell, I think he'd probably done it deliberately. Vast majority of people interviewed were, I would assume, from what they say, Democrat voters. And he asked them, well, what do you think the US needs most of all at this time, after the election? And they all said exactly the same things. Tolerance, understanding, getting rid of hate, unity, compromise, all those kind of things. And then he went on to ask them what they thought about Republicans. And then he went on to ask them questions about, well, you say compromise is really important. What would it look like? Give me an example of compromise moving forward. And again, as I say, I probably don't agree with his politics, and I'm sure he edited it to make his point. But it was really clever, because the answers were jaw-dropping. Having said we need to welcome and be tolerant, etc., as soon as he asked them what they thought of Republicans, immediately the words that came out were disgusting and racist and mindless. We hate them. And then when he asked them questions, it took lots of political examples and said, well, what would compromise look like? It took a while, but reluctantly, eventually, each person admitted that they wouldn't compromise at all on any of these issues. So, as I say, to be clear, I suspect my politics will be much closer to those being interviewed than the interviewer, but this is not about politics. This is about tolerance and acceptance. Why is it that in the West, we are always banging on about how we need to be more tolerant, more accepting, more welcoming, at the same time as becoming more intolerant? Witness the recent election in the US, Republican or Democrat, or here in the UK, Remainer or Brexiteer. Let's be honest, the unity we crave is the unity imposed by a dictator who simply forces everyone else to agree with them. And we've become, haven't we, as a society, so fearful of them, whoever they are. Now, how have we got into this mess? Well, all we see in our passage this morning is we've got into this mess by stopping talking about sin. Jesus treated everyone else equally because he knew that they were all sinners. And the only followers he wants are people who are sick and they admit that they are sick and that they need healing. People who think they're healthy, they are the ones who go around writing everybody else off. See, Jesus accepted Levi, but he also told Levi to come follow me. And Luke in his gospel tells us, he adds the bit that when Levi left his position to follow Jesus, he left everything he had, Luke tells us. In other words, Jesus accepted Levi as he was, but he didn't expect him to stay that way. In following Jesus, Jesus was expecting Levi to have to change. Jesus is the sin doctor, and he came to heal Levi, to heal him from sin. And if I think like that, then I can start to treat people in the same welcoming way too, like Jesus did. If I believe that everyone's a sinner, that includes me most of all. If I point out sin in someone else's life, I have no right to do that in a judgmental manner, like the Pharisees do, because I'm merely pointing out a symptom of a disease that we all share. Everybody's got it. So, let's keep talking about sin so that we can become more inclusive and welcoming. Because even secular commentators are starting to wake up about this. Last year I read a book, Dominion, by Tom Holland. By the way, that's Tom Holland, the British historian, not the guy who plays Spider-Man. Now, as Tom Holland has studied the history of Christianity in the West, he concludes that the major problem we face today is that we've lost the sense of the doctrine of original sin. He claims in his writings, that only original sin really gives equal opportunities for everybody. In fact, for those who know a little church history, he makes a very interesting observation. He says this: wokeness is a Pelagian movement that leads to self-righteousness. Now, whether you know who Pelagius was, he was a Brit, by the way, but whether you know who Pelagius was in history doesn't really matter. I'm sure you get the essence of what he's saying, that wokeness is a Pelagian movement that leads to self-righteousness. After all, isn't that what we see as we look around today? Don't we observe that? That in a world that is trying to remove sin from our vocabulary, we are now caught up in this rat race of trying all the time to prove that we're on the side of the good, that we're on the right side of history. We're the goodies, not the bad people. And so as I said, throughout my life, whenever our society has grappled with difficult issues, the church has been told to stop talking about sin. Now, these are all sorts of issues. I mean, you could mention loads. I don't know, divorce, abortion, human sexuality, euthanasia, you could go on. Complex moral issues. But every time Christians are told, you can talk about it, but just don't say it's a sin. It's the one thing you can't say, because that's judgmental, self-righteous, and divisive. And yet here in Mark 2, Jesus is explaining to the Pharisees that it is completely the other way around. It is people who admit that they are sinners, they're the ones who become welcoming and tolerant of others. And it's those who refuse to admit that they're sinners who become judgmental, just like the Pharisees. So wrapping this up, that is the £1 million question for today. Who do you say Jesus is? Is he the sin doctor? Is he your sin doctor? You see, if I believe in sin as an idea, if I think I desperately need the sin doctor, then it means on the one hand, I can speak out, for example, against racism when I see it, but without at the same time having to pretend that I'm blameless, without having to justify myself either. So I can call sin sin and not be judgmental because I believe that everyone, including myself, is a sinner. If my only hope is the sin doctor, then it should transform the way I view others. Because, as we started with The Incredibles, as Syndrome sort of said, when everyone is a sinner, there is no good people and bad people. There is just the sin doctor, Jesus, and everyone else. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you now and admit that we are sinners. I want to say that I am ill with sin and only Jesus can cure me. So please, cleanse me again. Cleanse me afresh. And may I live day by day with Jesus as my sin doctor. Amen. Now we're going to sing together, finish our service by singing, There is a Redeemer. Amen.